Alright, it is stupid hot and I have had a crap week, so how about a little fun? Also not wearing my brace, so I'm going to see how this goes. The question is, Mike, what's your favorite knife of all time? Your signature blade since, well, 1980. Well, it's not quite a knife. It is the Gerber Mark II. Yeah. All right, let's start by talking about my personal history with this particular blade. Now, as I've mentioned, well, over and over again in a lot of different videos, I started my study of martial arts in the mid-70s, specifically with Japanese martial arts, including Japanese weaponry, including swordsmanship, including, yes, Tantojutsu, knife fighting. But before that, I'd already collected a number of knives and sword-shaped objects and such because I was just very interested in them from a very young age. But the summer of 1980, before I went off to college, I was working a job in a print shop. Now, this is an old school print shop as compared to what we have today, where you just have everything done kind of digitally and you can do some really professional work in home. Back in those days, you used to have to bring in some sort of original or create some sort of original artwork where cutting and pasting was a literal thing you did. You actually cut things out and glued them together. Okay? So that's where that term comes from. But yeah, you'd have to take a photograph of something, turn it into a negative, that would turn it into a plate or set of plates, because yes, you'd have to run these things through a massive printing press and print every single color individually and hope it all lined up when you were done. And then you had other massive machines to collate and fold and bind. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I did one summer before I went off to college. Now, very amusingly, one of the jobs that we were contracted to do was a brochure newsletter for a local fraternal order of police. And in this police newsletter was a full-page advertisement for the Gerber Mark I and Mark II. Now, I don't have an example of the Mark I because it was smaller and I wasn't really interested in smaller knives at the time, which I regret now. I wish I would have gotten an original Mark I. But yeah, could you imagine today advertising something like this as an appropriate knife for patrol officers? Okay? Yeah. But I saw the pictures, I read the description, and I was hooked. I'd never actually seen one for real. There weren't any in my local mall knife shops. But then shortly thereafter, I went off to college. So I moved from Phoenix to Tucson. And in Tucson, they had this knife shop unlike any I'd ever seen before. It was massive. But they not only had production knives, they also had a lot of custom pieces. Some very, very high-end, gorgeous blades that were certainly outside of my budget. But they also had a lot of antiques, including a selection of first and second generation Mark IIs. So let's talk about, well, the different versions of this knife, at least in terms of the examples that I have, and then just for fun we'll do a little action section about, well, putting them to questionable use since 1980. Okay, I promised to post some pictures because this is going to be a little hard to see. Let's start by talking first generation versus second generation. Well, what do they all have in common? They're all pretty much the same length, which is a 7-inch blade and a 5-inch grip. They've all got the same basic grip shape. So you've got this actually very ergonomic swept forward guard that could sort of function to catch an opponent's blade, but it's kind of tiny for that job. However, yeah, it definitely keeps your hand from sliding up the blade, even under a great deal of force, and no hot spots doesn't bite into you. The kind of oval palm swell grip, I find this to be just amazingly comfortable, ergonomic. Yeah, just love it. And then sticking out the bottom end is this conical shape with the truncated end that even, yes, back in the day they called a skull crusher. So it's designed to be theoretically an impact weapon. It does have a hole through it for a lanyard if you decide you want to go that way. But yeah, the feel of the grip is just amazing, comfortable, and we'll talk about this kind of questionable thing I keep doing with the knife later. But the first and second generation were both made out of L6 tool steel, which is definitely not stainless, which is a weird choice because this knife was introduced in 1966 for Vietnam. So it was available at the PXs to purchase, by your infantrymen or whoever else wanted one for use in the field. And there were some significant issues with that. First of all, the original Scabbard Sheath, whatever you want to call it, well, different versions of this basic leather thing. With, again, you've got a tie down here if you want to wrap it around your thigh. You've got the hooks for a web belt and some other lanyards and things, and then it's got a snap closure. Now, the standard one comes in this brown, this tan. But I hate these. And apparently so did a lot of GIs. This knife is such a hypodermic needle of a blade that if you sheathe this in a leather sheath even slightly wrong, it will go clean through the sheath and potentially clean into you. So, take a look at the more modern nylon sheaths. I like those a lot better. But this is the history of what they came in. And yes, I've actually put a knife through these myself with very little effort whatsoever. So I know how easy it is. Thankfully, it wasn't attached to me at the time. But yeah, I've heard horror stories by people who tried to use these in the field. Worse, apparently, if it gets wet. So, sheath, terrible. At least the originals. Blade design. Alright, 1966 is when the first generation came out. And it was very strange. I mean, they were basically trying to one-up the infamous Sykes-Fairbairn with this thing. A combat dagger. So the original versions didn't have any serrations on them. What you're seeing is a very narrow, especially as compared to all other generations. Okay, it's a much narrower blade. But what you've got, and one of the things that made me fall absolutely in love with this thing, especially since I love katana, right, Japanese style swords, is you've got edge planes that go smoothly and directly into razor sharp edges. There is no secondary grind on this knife at all. You can shave with these out of the box. And it tapers down to a point, as I said, that would qualify as a hypodermic needle. Its ability to slip into people, yeah. However, L6 tool steel, well, the way they harden these holds a fantastic razor edge. But how narrow that tip is, yeah, notorious for snapping off. These things are like glass in certain ways, especially the narrower the original first two generations. And I know this through unfortunate experience. And I've actually seen versions where they have reshaped the tip into something that's a whole lot blunter than this, just to recover the knife after one of those disasters. I'm also familiar, unfortunately, with the actual construction. The handle is aluminum, okay, cast aluminum. And then it goes into a rat tail tang that is basically sunk in there, and then the handle's cast around it. But it is a thin rat tail. How do I know that? Because I broke my first one off right there at the base of the blade. Yeah. shattered, as I said, like glass. Granted, I was doing something stupid with it, but yeah. I hope my knife doesn't shatter that easily. So that is a risk. So yeah, it's not very weather resistant, moisture resistant, anything like that. You got to take a lot of care of it. So a lot of the old examples are just rusted, corroded, stained to death, including, well, my favorite example. We'll look at that in a second. But the original, like I said, no serrations, very thin. The original two versions had a distinct wasp-waist, and then it kind of swelled out in this belly. And we'll take a look at how that works, because that makes it phenomenal in the cut and slash. Not necessarily for any kind of utility or survival use, but for intended purposes, yeah, I really, really like that. Now, the really weird thing about Generation 1 that didn't survive into any future generations, let's see if you can see it. You know something weird? No, it's not your eyes. There is about a 15-degree cant in this blade by design. Now, there are people who bought this knife and thought it was bent and tried to unbend it, and of course then it just shattered when they tried to unbend it. But this is by design. This is kind of a controversial design choice, but I kind of like it. Okay, what does this do? Well, this is arguable because there's several versions of the story. But in one version, the idea is when you sheathe this thing, if you sheathe it basically with the curved side against your body, well, it conforms to legs and hips and calves and things like that. So the handle doesn't stick out as much as other knives. Conversely, if you sheathed it this way, with this side against your body, and you wore it up against your waist, it would sit tighter up into your waist, just right a little snugger for those special operations. Okay, that's one supposed reason why the knife is, well, bent. The other reason I've heard that the knife is bent, or maybe they just tried to make use of the bent knife, is depending on how you're going to deploy it. If I'm holding it in a fencer's grip with my thumb up on the side, blade extended, and again we'll take a look at this in the action section, it kind of forms a fencer's grip, almost like a French grip on a foil or something like that. So the idea is it has the knife in line. On the other hand, if I assume the grip in the other direction, and I'm intending to do any close range stabbing, yeah, ergonomically it's kind of aiming for that, and again I'll show that in the action section. But anywhere in between, yeah, it's weird. If you're holding this in some kind of handshake or hammer grip, it definitely feels crooked. In the reverse grip, well, for me, if I hold it so basically the handle's canted down with my palm, I can get some pretty good blade alignment, and then if I shift the rotation and hug it up against my wrist, and again I'll show this a little bit in the action section, that curvature kind of works. But again, if you're used to a knife that's straight, like pretty much every single knife on the planet is, this is going to take a lot of getting used to. So, super skinny blade, potentially quite fragile, not resistant to the elements or moisture or anything like that, high maintenance. But one of the things the first generation had that was cool, and you can see is actually, well, here's one of the vulnerabilities, flaking off this blade, is what they called cat's tongue or cat skin, where they sprayed molten stainless steel onto the aluminum, which created this kind of gray but sparkly sandpaper texture for excellent grip. So the first generations would have these features. However, they didn't sell very well because, again, people thought they were weird and kind of scary. So to make them friendlier and maybe more useful, first thing they in the second generation, they straightened the blade out, kind of. Let's take a little bit of a look at the second generation. If you look at it closely, yeah, that blade isn't quite straight from the side, but that's all the way it's ground. You do have serrations added in to make it a survival tool. Survival, yeah, sure it is. Sure it is. It's a little bit wider, a little bit stouter, kept the wasp-waisting, kept that beautiful edge bevel, so there's no secondary grind, razor sharp, slightly beefier in the tip. But yeah, it's a little lopsided in the way it's gone. It's a little flatter this way than it is this way, away from the serrations, basically, curves away a little bit. So maybe they're trying to preserve a little bit of that curvature to hug it to your body, but when you put it in a sheath, you really don't notice, okay? You might notice a little bit in the hand that it's slightly lopsided. But with that wasp-waisting, that belly, you've definitely got a lot more feel and sensation of where that blade is. And since it's sturdier and a little bit heavier, about an ounce or so, for me, that is just marvelous. Now, they also kind of did away with the whole cat's tongue sprayed molten stainless steel thing. They realized that was kind of expensive, and they just did a texturing and then covered the whole thing in, well, yeah, paint. It's a sturdy paint. It doesn't come off very easily. It's kind of an epoxy. But, yeah, so they basically kind of made it look like the other one by making this generation black and gray. But the grip is still the same shape. The balance, is, like I said, is really wonderful. And this generation, personally, is my favorite. Well, like I said, L6, yeah, easy to corrode. Doesn't hold up to the elements. And, yes, still pretty brittle in the steel. Holds a great edge. Sharper than any knife I had encountered. I actually called this my cursed knife for a long time because people would pick it up and go, and they'd say the incantation. What's the incantation? Oh, is it sharp? And they'd touch it and they'd be bleeding like a sieve. Yeah, just all over the place. Yeah. That razor sharp. Not something that, well, a lot of people are expecting in a knife, especially back in, the 70s and 80s. Yeah, this was a special kind of monster. Talk about application in a second, but let's talk about the future generations that, well, I have kind of mixed feelings about.